Hi, everyone. My name is Stacy Cervenka, and I live in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Hello, and my name is Maida Avdich. I live in Omaha, Nebraska.
And we're here to talk to you tonight about the importance of mental health counseling or mental health in blindness rehabilitation. Recently, many members of the blind and low vision community put out an open letter to the board of directors of the NFB and the board of directors of NBPCB. And some of the one of the recommendations we made is that we really think that students or clients or consumers at blindness rehabilitation centers could benefit from having a mental health counselor on staff and have that be integrated into the curriculum or into the program. So Maida, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Sure. So I am a provisionally licensed clinical social worker here in Omaha. I got my master's in social work and a master's in public administration this past August of 2020. And I actually went to a training center myself. I am blind, and I went to a rehabilitation center and graduated in 2017. I think at that point, while I was in training, I saw a need. There was definitely an unmet need for mental health services within this population, getting these while they are receiving these types of services. And that need my desire to fulfill that need has only grown in the last 3-4 years that I've been in school and seeing how much of a struggle it is for individuals receiving rehab services. I only have experience in blindness, but I can imagine that a lot of this is probably true also for other non-blindness, other types of disabilities, rehabilitation services and programs for other types of disabilities as well. There's definitely a need to incorporate holistic, comprehensive mental health services within these facilities.
Excellent. Now, can you tell us a little bit more? I know that you recently completed, was it your clinical internship?
Yes.
Okay, so your clinical internship at a blindness rehabilitation center that does incorporate mental health counseling into the curriculum. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did attend my first practicum or internship, or interchangeable terms, but I completed my first one in the fall semester of 2018, and it was at a blindness rehabilitation center, a residential treatment or residential facility, and there was an on-site social worker and licensed mental health therapist on staff. One thing I really appreciated about this center that helped to reduce stigma and stigma associated with the need for mental health services is that everybody who was there for training automatically was enrolled in mental health counseling as part of their curriculum. And then so in the beginning, everybody would do it, and the counselor, the social worker would evaluate each individual as needed based on their own specific concerns and any history of mental health conditions, anything that they were currently struggling with. And based on that evaluation, the decision was made of how frequently they needed, how much interventions for mental health they would need. And it was really great because you could see a lot of the students would address a lot of different types of concerns, and some were blindness related and some were not. And yeah, like I said, I saw it really pushed or mitigated the stigma associated with mental health because everybody was going, and it was just a part of the training curriculum.
That makes sense, and I like what you're saying, because I'm one of those people that think everybody should be in counseling because it makes us more aware of our thoughts and our motivations and kind of the feelings that we might have but not know how to name. So I think counseling is just beneficial for anybody.
For sure.
And if you are certainly if you are away from home, perhaps away from your parents for the first time, or you're away, maybe you're staying with a roommate, you're in a totally new environment, you're a part of a program that can be stressful because you're learning a lot of new things. So I can certainly see why counseling would be, particularly important during this time.
And yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciated that the therapist that was on site was, you know, an integral part of the staff. She knew, and I, as her intern and her other social work intern that was there at the same time, we all knew what the program entailed, what other experiences the students were having while they were in training. It was not a step. It wasn't like, because when I went to training, I was offered if I wanted to go to counseling in the community. I had when I did my intake paperwork, when I started training at my blindness training center that I attended, they asked me, you know, would you like to continue counseling? We can make a referral to a community therapist. And that's great. That was awesome that they made that offer. But I think what makes that harder is that therapist doesn't know what you're going through a training center as with such a dramatic and life-altering and challenging transition into training and throughout the training process. So whereas in this case, this person is in-house and they know they have the mental health background whether they're a counselor or a social worker or a psychologist, psychotherapist, whatever their academic discipline background is, they have a mental health background, but they also understand the blindness and rehab aspects of why this person is here. You know, they're going to know more about blindness than a typical person coming from off the street. And I would say that in my experience, when I was doing my internship, my supervisor that was the counselor there was cited. I would say and she was fantastic. She did a great job. Personally, I think just having experienced the training piece of it and the mental health academic knowledge, I think that it would be best, this type of role would be best suited for somebody who has gone through training or at the very least is blind themselves. Only because they have the lived experience and they also have the professional academic knowledge of that is needed to be a mental health professional.
Now, here's something that occurs to me when we're talking about this, though. I've heard rehabilitation professionals say, oh, well, when we send students to counseling, they undo everything that we're trying to do. And I can kind of understand what they're saying, but I also think like a training center, it seems odd to me to say that they're undoing our work, like they're undoing what we're trying to do, because I could see how you want the mental health counselor to be an integrated part of the staff, but you don't want that counselor to have some sort of, goal or objective with the student to fit some sort of model or do some sort of thing. Like you still need to be focusing on the student, not trying to turn the student into something. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, okay. It does. I think that what you're saying about rehab professionals being concerned that a counselor might undo what is being taught in training. I think that is a risk that you do run if you are sending somebody if you send a student or a client out to somebody in the community who has no knowledge and no background knowledge of what this entails. So even if you have a good relationship with that counselor, that might help a little bit, right? They might know, oh, this person is coming from, I don't know, Omaha Center for the Blind, which is not a real place. I'm just making that up. But if you—
Sorry, you said it, you have to found it tomorrow.
Right, exactly. Now I got to do it now. If they have that relationship, it might help a little bit so that they understand what the goals are of the program and why the person is there. But I think that there is an ability there certainly is, it is possible, it is feasible to be an impartial mental health provider whose primary goal is to work for the mental health needs of your clients, while still working within the context of a rehab center, because it's done in other contexts, right? So if we look at mental health therapists who work in drug treatment, so obviously the purpose of drug treatment is to help somebody become clean or reduce or mitigate their drug addiction. That is kind of an overall objective, but as a counselor who works, as a mental health counselor who works within that context, your primary goal is to advocate for the mental health needs of your client. And that is what you're focused on. So I absolutely think it's possible. I know that there were situations that came up during my internship where a student was feeling concerned, students and clients were feeling concerned about their struggles that they might have with their instructors or with their roommates, and that was something that they would address with the counselor. And then when we would have interprofessional meetings, we would work to help. The counselor would come in with the objective of advocating for the client's mental health needs within the context of the interprofessional team.
Now, two questions that I have. Well, I guess the first one is, how did you maintain the confidentiality of your client when you were meeting with this interdisciplinary team? Like when you were meeting with the O&M instructor, the home ec instructor, how did you not spill the beans? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, absolutely. So you only, really the rule was like, you only told as much as was needed to tell to help advocate for the client's needs. So if I went to an interprofessional meeting and I know that Jane Doe is struggling with her cooking teacher, I don't need to come into that meeting and say, oh, Jane Doe told me she really hates working with you, right? I can come into that meeting and say, Jane Doe is really struggling in the program, and we're working on ways to mitigate some of the anxiety that she is experiencing. And I think these are things that might help her, right? So I'm not having to breach that confidentiality and tell her. I think to some degree, when you are working within that interprofessional context, some of it is, we're meeting about the client. So there's some confidentiality concerns are going to be different than if you were working with an outside counselor, because you are a part of that team, but you are only telling the rest of the team as much as needed to help address whatever concerns the client is having, versus, telling them everything that maybe the client wouldn't feel comfortable with others knowing.
And so then I know that generally speaking, when you go to mental health counseling, they say everything you tell me is confidential. There's all these ethical rules. However, if you tell me you're going to harm yourself or, a child or a vulnerable adult or someone else, and I have to do it. So then does that change? Like, is there some sort of additional information that you give clients who talk to you? Do you say, look, I might share some information? Like, how do you?
Yes. Yeah. So again, because you are working within the context of an interprofessional team within a mental health, within a rehab center, you do at the beginning of each new relationship that you have with the client, you do tell them. What I sat in on intakes when a client was first starting training, and you would explain to them part of the consent process is, we are here for your training, and I am here to primarily address your mental health, but in order for me to best serve you, things might come up that I'm only going to tell them what I have to tell them, but things might come up that I have to talk about within the interprofessional team. And again, I think that also applies in other settings. Just to be clear, this isn't something that is very unusual. I just worked in my second internship at a community mental health center. So as a therapist and a social worker, I worked in a partial hospitalization clinic, or a day treatment program. And a lot of stuff the clients would tell me, if it was something that needed to be addressed within their to help them with their treatment, with their care plan, then we as a team would talk about it, and they understand that there is a team that is serving them, which includes a psychiatrist, which includes us as therapists, which includes recreational therapy, peer support services, pharmacy, all those people are privy to information that might directly impact their care. If they're telling me that something that doesn't need to be shared in order to help them with their progress, then I won't feel the need to share, and I'll only tell what I have to tell to advance their care.
And again, I like what you said, about really focusing on, like, your job is really to, maintain and improve the mental health of the client. So in keeping that in mind, that your goal during this is to, your responsibility or allegiance or whatever is to the client, and you're there to improve their mental health, not sort of like psychologically get them to do something, or know what I mean? Not like, okay, so our center wants you to be this way, so I'm going to psychologically move you in that direction. But like, you're there to help the consumer's mental health.
Absolutely. I think, I can't speak to the ethical codes of conduct for any other profession, but I can say from a social work standpoint, that would be unethical on multiple levels. So that would not be appropriate for us to do, regardless regardless of the setting that we're working in. There's not, your goal can never be coercion. Your goal is to serve the client in whatever capacity, whether that's mental health or case management or resource navigation or whatever it might be, serve them. And one of the primary values that we hold as social workers, and I can say with some degree of certainty, every other discipline that provides mental health, one of our core values is maintaining clients' autonomy and ensuring autonomy over their decisions. So it cannot be a coercive, we're in cahoots with everybody else to try to get the client to do X, Y, Z. That would not be appropriate.
Excellent. And now, before we go on to the other one of the other topics that we kind of outlined, one of I think talking about why, like really clarifying why consumers might benefit from mental health counseling. And I know we talked a little bit at the beginning about, or maybe we'll talk about this later when we talk about the pathologizing of disabilities. Maybe that would be better then. So I guess moving right along. So what are some ways that you think that mental health counseling and mental health services could be integrated into, a progressive, disability, justice-oriented rehabilitation center?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm going to reiterate what you said earlier, that everybody can benefit from counseling and therapy regardless of your circumstances. So when we look at a whole person that's coming into training, they will have circumstances. There's multiple circumstances that might cause mental health concerns or conditions to come up. So it could be things that are related to their blindness, things that are not. It could be trauma, it could be genetic factors, family history of mental health. It could be a lot of different things. So, and as mental health providers who are licensed and have the background to address all of these issues, we can work with all of it. So maybe the person has trauma that has nothing to do with their blindness, and we can address that. Or maybe they are experiencing grief after sudden loss of blindness, or another thing that often comes up for people, regardless of the type of disability, is societal ableism, which essentially is, society acting like you causing discrimination based on your disability, and that can look like having low expectations or unrealistic expectations, or not providing services that should be provided to help you succeed. It can look like a lot of different things. All of those things can be addressed when we look at a whole person that's coming into training, acknowledging their concerns and what might be negatively impacting their mental health, whether it's related to their blindness or not. So I think that, the biggest key here is treating somebody as a whole person and not trying to compartmentalize, this is related to blindness, so we're going to address it. This is not related to blindness, and we're not. And also not taking away somebody's autonomy to say, hey, I am struggling because of my blindness, and I do need to talk about that, and I do need to work through some stuff, rather than just assuming that if we have a positive attitude and focus on skills, that all of that will magically go away, because it doesn't. You look at people post-training and still see, certainly training helps people to improve their skill level and to be able to move on in life, but you still see a significantly higher level of unemployment. It's improved, it's certainly not the 70% that we hear about with blindness in general, but it's still higher. Unemployment rates are still very high after training, and education is still a challenge. And so but these people have great skills. They can read Braille, they use their canes, they can cook for themselves, manage their homes, but yet they're still struggling. And so there are barriers.
They're afraid to walk into a job interview and afraid of how people are going to perceive them when they walk into a job interview, or yeah.
Yep. And I think that there's sorry to cut you off. I was just going to say, I do think, no, you're fine. So I was just going to say, I think that there's certainly, I know in a lot of training centers, there's group exercise or group discussions that try to address these, whether it's called whatever term, they use to describe it, but there'll be these group discussions that try to address that, and you'll have peer support, which is super helpful. Peer support is great. I never want to devalue its benefit, that talking to your peers who are in training with you, talking to people who are former graduates, those are all beneficial things. But if people are having significant diagnosable anxiety that is impacting their ability to be able to perform in training, right? To meet their outcomes and to meet learning objectives. If they're having significant depression where it's hard for them to get out of bed to get to class, those things cannot be dismissed and assume that and then wonder later on why somebody might be struggling, or not consider that when we are looking at why somebody isn't meeting their goals.
Well, and you know, some things that you said that I really like is, you know, I think about how public health experts have identified racism as a public health issue and as a mental health, you know, as an issue that contributes to mental health. And so ableism would be too, it would seem, because when you have a disability, you experience microaggressions all day long. You know, you go to the store and there's little ways that you're kind of made to feel inferior, made to feel like you're, you know, typhoid Mary or whatever. And so, so I mean, that has to impact you in some way, even if you're an extremely confident person. Absolutely. And I also think about like kids who grow up blind, like even if they have wonderful parents and their parents believe in them and they get the best skills they can get, you know, they might go through a school system where the teachers make them feel terrible, or where they're alienated by their peers. I mean, you could go to a school and have like wonderful cane skills, wonderful braille, like lovely personality, and you could still run into like bullying or rejection by your teachers and your peers. So you could have a really difficult childhood, you know, experience that does play into you as an adult. And I think about myself, like I went through, you know, a 9-month program at Louisiana Center for the Blind. And then after that, I ended up going like every other week for counseling for like several years. And I actually feel like the mental health counseling I did is what has been the biggest factor in why I've succeeded, like career-wise and in life. Like I feel like that mental health stuff was for me, and it might be different for people, but it was more important to me than like learning to sew on a button, you know? I mean, that's right, but, you know, and I also want to kind of say what you said about, you know, the group seminars are fine, but they're seminars. And if you are struggling with something, you may not want to share that in a group context where maybe you're the only one in the room who feels that way. Or maybe, you know, if you said something, everyone would shout you down or shame you or make you feel like, oh, you're totally wrong because of the way you feel. So, you know, I think about when I was in training, I knew one girl who she would always say like exactly the right things in training. Like she always had that teacher's pet way about her. But then behind the scenes, she was like, I don't want to use my cane. And it was like, she was like a different girl in seminar. So it was like, if she was with a counselor, perhaps she could bring her authentic self to that and actually deal with her issues instead of like perform at seminar. Is that
absolutely? No, for sure. So I think, you know, you're always going to have more people who are more introverted, people who are more extroverted, some who are more comfortable with expressing themselves and what they're struggling with in a group setting. And this is why we offer, when we look at, you know, on a therapeutic level, we look at group therapy versus individual therapy. This is why we offer both, because different strokes for different folks, right? For lack of a better word with that cliche, but some things are going to work better for others, and some things are going to work better for individuals who are more introverted. And yeah, you are. And then like the example that you gave, the young woman who felt that pressure to say the right things, but really on an emotional internal level, she was not there yet. She was not. Yeah. So, and that is absolutely something that clearly she wasn't able to make a breakthrough just talking to peers, just talking in seminar. You know, she was not there yet. And you know, we can't guarantee that going to therapy would have changed that, but there's certainly an increased likelihood that she would have it would have been a safe space for her to have, you know, more confidential, more comfortable one-on-one conversations to try to break through what is causing her to not be able to make that progress in training and really use the skills that she was being taught. And you know, I think it's a really good example of somebody who would be struggling. And I saw that a lot. I think when I was in training as well, we would see those group activities, and you would see the people who are very extroverted. There were a few of us that would talk a lot, and then there were some people right? I feel, yep, I was very extroverted. I would talk to you, but then you would see, you know, the overwhelming majority of the student population was quiet. And sure, there were probably a lot of people who were just taking it in and were quiet and doing just fine. But there was also probably a large proportion of the student body that was struggling with at least some of these topics and ideas, but wasn't comfortable, but they were not comfortable coming forward in a group setting to talk about that.
Makes sense. And, you know, I want to take my, you know, responsibility for like ways that I've contributed to this. And when I was at LCB, I mean, I remember like one thing that really sticks with me is that we would talk about how we identify ourselves. Like, do we identify ourselves as blind, low vision, visually impaired, partially sighted, whatever. And, you know, it didn't become like, I understand the like trying to talk about how the word blind is not a shameful word. And the word blind, like the blind community is, it's a proud, powerful community, and we identify as blind, and that's important to us. But I don't think that we should shout people down and argue with them and shame them for wanting to use a different identifier. And now, I mean, I prefer blind and I prefer low vision. Like, I don't like the word visually impaired. I prefer, but I don't want to shame somebody or shout them down because that's what they prefer. I mean, and I think now we're becoming more sensitive to that. Like, okay, do you want to be called LGBTQ? Do you want to be called queer? Do you want to be called gay? Do you want to be called like whatever? Or do you want to be called Hispanic or Mexican or Chicano or whatever? So like understanding that people identify, like they use identifiers for reasons that are often very personal to them.
So we know, yep, absolutely. So we know that shame, just from a lot of research and a lot of you know, work from previous mental health providers and researchers, that shaming people in any context almost never ever works. It does not get you the results. We can look at kind of as a comparison right now with the COVID-19 pandemic in looking at people who are not willing to comply with public health measures. If we want people to change and do what's safest for them and for everybody around them, shaming them does not work, right? No. And I think a lot of us have been guilty in the past of, you know, you feel that pressure, you want to do the right thing and you want everybody to comply. So a lot of us have engaged in that in the past, but it does not yield. The irony is it doesn't yield the results that we want.
No.
So it just pushes people further kind of into their camps of or their mentality of how they feel. So that's one piece of it. The shaming doesn't ever work. And regardless whether it's the term you use to identify.
How dare you not call yourself blind? The blind is with a proud, like, okay, like it's not untrue, but like
but this doesn't work. The technique. Yep. The technique does not work to get people to think that way.
And you have reasons that I don't understand for wanting to identify in a certain way. Like you might, you know?
Right. Yep. Absolutely. And I went through that struggle too as an individual on a personal level. I went through that and had to figure it out. And it wasn't somebody beating a dead horse telling me that that's wrong. You can't. That's not what got me to change my perception, right? What got me to change my perception was really when people took the time to process with me why I was feeling this way and how the changing the terminology, why language matters, for me personally, that's what worked. And but it was kindness, it was compassion, it was taking the time to break it down, it was having those one-on-one conversations, it was letting me self-explore my own internal dialogue about why I was struggling with that identity. That's what made it change. It wasn't people beating me over the head with it over and over. And I think that that's true regardless, even if we're not talking about the identity, if we're talking about using any skills, using a cane in various contexts, using screen readers versus magnification or whatever, I think that really kind of like trying to just force it upon people is, even if it's the best skill and the best idea in the world, being very forceful about it does not work. And that's something that we kind of have to contend with from a mental health perspective and from a cultural perspective, regardless of the setting, right? Whether it's in blindness settings or just overall in our society. I think that's something that we have to contend with. I want to go back really quick to something you mentioned earlier about the idea of racism being, and all the isms being, public health crises. So there's a term, this is a good little nugget of information. There's a term that's called weathering, and weathering essentially, and it's come out of this public health research within the framework of racism. Weathering is an idea that your body will ultimately, on a physical and mental health level, will suffer from the consequences of racism day in and day out. So whether that's microaggressions, like you mentioned, or overt, obvious racism, or lack of access to
systemic racism.
Systemic, yep.
Yeah. I mean, if you systemic ableism would be like if public transportation in your town is not fully funded, and it's like, oh, only the poor and disabled use it, therefore it's the second class service. Well, then that systemic ableism is causing you to go out in the rain or the snow and like do damage to your body or stand out in the sun, you know, so it's systemic as well.
Yep, absolutely. Systemic racism. And so, yeah, so you made the connection really well. Exactly what I was going to say, Stacey, is that although I haven't seen any research to back this up yet in regards to other types of isms. I've only seen it in the context of racism, but I would instinctually think that if we are seeing this in racism as an ism, then you're going to see the same types of weathering on people's physical and mental health, and when they experience other types of marginalization, whether that's transphobia, whether that's ableism that we're talking about. Other types of isms are also going to see the same thing because they're happening on both an individual and a systemic level. So if we don't address those isms in the context, and what a perfect time to address them than in training, right? Because that is where we are trying
growing,
to work on. Yeah, absolutely. Like,
so
it's now than when.
Holistic.
Yes.
We're not pathologizing blindness here. We're not saying if you are blind, therefore you have a mental health condition, but we're saying that because of the way society treats you, because you may have grown up, because of ableism, because of stigma, that's difficult. And so you may have to work through that in order to be really successful. And we're saying that some people might have trauma that's completely unrelated to blindness, or mental health stuff completely unrelated to blindness. It's not even like tangentially. And you might have some folks who recently did go blind and their mental health concerns are related to blindness, and that's fine. You know, that's like some people's mental health concerns are related to their family, their job, their blindness, whatever. And so it's totally fine.
So this pathologizing, yes, it's absolutely. And this pathologizing thing has come up. I've heard it come up in blind circles, communities a lot. When I started, my passion for introducing mental health into these disability spaces it started while I was in training. And I remember talking to staff members at my training center, and staff members who really respected my desire to go into mental health. They were really supportive and thought it was great. And then when I said, let's do it in a center like this, I got a lot of pushback, right? And it was a lot of the argument came to this idea of not wanting to pathologize. And I think there's some good, understandable reasons why people worry about this. People, especially who are kind of some of the senior members of the organized blind movement, or of any blindness types of circles or communities. When they were growing up, or when they were younger, they lived in a time when blindness was pathologized from a mental health perspective, right? It was assumed if you were blind, wow, you just must be so maladjusted. Like, there was this false connection made between blindness and social and emotional intelligence, and mental maturation. Lots of different things where false connections were made between blindness and a lot of these mental health concepts. And we know that's not true. We know that people with blindness and a variety of other disabilities don't inherently have maladaptive behaviors and struggle with maladjustment overall. So I think that that's just something that we have to debunk. And I think that that misconception has to be debunked, and also to recognize that it is possible to still introduce mental health services in blindness spaces and disability spaces without automatically pathologizing, right? This is where I think having somebody who has a really good life experience background, is blind themselves, and or has gone through training themselves, that this is where I think it's important to have a professional who has that life experience to come in, because it will be harder, not impossible, but harder for somebody who is sighted, who has no background in working with disabilities, to maybe have as much of an understanding of the nuances of why mental health works in these spaces, but why it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who is blind is automatically going to have mental health issues just because of their blindness.
Maida, we're running out of Zoom time. I'm using the free version here. So I wanted to make two quick things, and then I want to make sure we hit our last topic. So the two quick things that I wanted to quickly say is that, I think one thing that's really interesting when people talk about like, we don't want to have the stigma of mental health services at our center. It's like, well, blindness is stigmatized. Using a cane is stigmatized. Using Braille is stigmatized. But we say it is respectable to be blind. Yes, it's stigmatized, but there's no reason. Or using a cane is often stigmatized and seen as a symbol of, infirmity, but that's wrong. It's a symbol of independence. So I don't understand why we can't say mental health might be stigmatized out there, but we know it's not. Like your cane might be stigmatized, your blindness might be stigmatized, mental health conditions might be stigmatized, but not in here. The other thing I wanted to quickly say, and before we really go into it, the last topic before we run out here, is that, my husband runs a structured discovery training center. And one thing that he's noticed is that one of the reasons why many blind people struggle to find employment is not necessarily because of their hard skills, their blindness skills, or their academic health, but it's because of these mental health conditions. And so it's from a pragmatic perspective, now because of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, it's more important than ever for voc rehab agencies to make sure that consumers find competitive integrated employment. And so if your goal is to make sure that people find employment, then you need to do whatever you can to get that outcome. And
absolutely,
what he's feeling is like, the center might put out wonderful travelers who read Braille great and, have a college degree, but they're held back by emotional intelligence or fear or anxiety,
depression.
And that's something that needs to be addressed if we actually want consumers to find jobs. Like that is our goal. We are vocational rehabilitation, and whatever it takes to help people find employment, we need to consider that. The final thing I wanted you to talk about was how can rehabilitation centers that have never done it before, how could they integrate mental health services into their curricula? Like, what are some ways that you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of centers are modeled off of, having multiple classes in one day. You'll have Braille, then cane travel, then home management, et cetera, et cetera. So just simply adding that extra class as counseling. And like I said earlier, it is really effective if you automatically have counseling as part of everybody's curriculum. It reduces stigma. It helps people feel more comfortable to try counseling. Somebody might not have ever experienced it. So, and they don't know what to expect, or that's.
Well, if you're going to have wood shop, why not have counseling? I mean, the argument for wood shop, let me say, my husband, actually, we have a dedicated wood shop in our house. My husband is out in it now building a toolbox for my son. So all the love for wood shop. However, if we're going to make wood shop a class because we say it's confidence building, then would counseling not probably be as or more?
Yeah. Beneficial. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So I would say that's a big piece of it. Have mental health openly talked about in, like, when we do seminars. I think seminars are great. By no means everything we have talked about seminars, I think they should stay. They're wonderful, but I think that mental health should be talked about as part of them and kind of infused throughout the whole culture of the center. Very openly talked about. Have some continuing or extra kind of continuing education offered for staff members, the whole staff, and that certainly that dedicated mental health counselor can provide that continuing education to everybody on anxiety, on depression, on severe and persistent mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar, those kinds of things. trauma-informed care, introducing trauma-informed care practices. Everybody, regardless of
so important. That's so important.
Yep. And regardless of your title, regardless of what you're doing, you can learn some basics of using trauma-informed concepts in your teaching.
We know that's a problem at certain training centers. Like, I mean, we know that there are centers that are traumatizing students and doing things like where they might have been traumatized in the past, and they're doing things that aren't helpful. And I mean, my Facebook, because I have a current status, that's a thing. So, and I also had someone who commented on my Facebook, it was either today or yesterday, that she worked in adult education, and she thinks that training center staff need to learn a lot more about how adults learn, because often we treat our adult clients the same way as we treat our youth program folks. Like we teach our youth program folks the same way we teach our adults. I am the, you know, they're sort of treated that way in their own way. And so finding out how do adult learners learn best, because it's probably not fear and shame and coercion.
Yeah. It's actually not good for anybody, but
not kids. Not that we were for that for kids either.
Right. For nobody, absolutely. But yeah, especially for adults who are very used to having their own level of autonomy, and you're trying to infantilize them, that can be problematic. So having trauma-informed concepts included, or trauma-informed care, and there are, you know, credentials that you can take, and or a certification, right? It's, you know, very short, a few classes just to get the basics. Also, those continuing education offers to educate students or educate people about mental health, those can also be included or implemented for students. Spend a seminar on mental health and some basics of self-care, right? And basics of interpersonal relationships and what makes them work and not work as well. Very basic fundamental concepts of for all of those topics. Those can all be included. And I just want to reiterate too, and I know I had started saying this earlier, but just to make it really clear that even if for rehab professionals, if they are looking at this and wondering why, you know, I'm focused on blindness, that's all I have funding for, that's all I feel that needs to be addressed. Even if that's kind of the thought process that you're experiencing right now, which is understandable, I get it, right? But the thing is that mental health will impede people's progress.
Yes.
It will make your client not reach their full potential. And I know for a lot of people we're speaking to the choir, right? You get it. But if we don't address it, then your client will not reach their full potential. Yes. And that reduces your outcomes of your whole training center. And our whole goal is to get people gainfully employed and independent. And so if that's really the thing we want to focus on, then we have to address this elephant in the room.
And I think too that, you know, we're aware that whether somebody's a state agency or they're, you know, a community rehabilitation program like a private or nonprofit center, people have different, you know, different budgets. They have different constructs that they have to work within, different laws they have to work within. So it might look different from one center to the other. You know, my husband worked for a day, you know, like a community rehabilitation program, like Society for the Blind, for 8 years. And they now have a full-time counselor on staff, but that person if they're funded through a grant, and any blind person in the community can utilize their services. So no students are required to go to them, but like students go to them, staff go to them, blind people in the community go to them, because it's a way of saying, here, it's free mental health support. Like you need it, like it's here. And, you know, that might not be as comprehensive as what you're talking about, but that for them, it's a grant, it works, and it actually expands out into the community, not just
for sure. It's wonderful. Society. Yeah, absolutely. It is. There is no, you know, strict like rule book of this is how you have to do this, and this is what it has to look like. It's just, I think, and that's another thing when you asked how can rehab centers integrate this into their centers, look at lots of examples of how other people are doing it. We just talked about 2 different places and they look pretty different, and that's okay, right? There's not one right answer of how to incorporate this. So, and
Society for the Blind, generally, it's not a certified structured discovery center, and they use different, like they use you know, several different techniques, but they are generally, you know, they encourage students to use sleep shades. They encourage students to use long canes. Now, it's not required, but so, I mean, they use a lot of structured discovery methodology, and they're totally fine with the counseling. And again, my husband runs the Nebraska Center, and he's looking all the time about how to implement mental health, finding ways to do that. And so it has nothing to do with structured discovery or not structured discovery. It's just good practice. It's just good practice.
Right. It absolutely is. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Maida.
Thank you for having me. Yes, it was great to talk to you. I hope that everybody, I hope you all found this informative. We can link my email address below if you have questions for both Stacy and I'm certainly willing to chat with whoever, whether you're a consumer or an agency representative, or a facility or center, a skills center representative, training center representative. I'd be happy to talk to you. So,
you know what? And I'm also thinking this real quick. I think having counseling would also help. You know, we're in this big discussion in the blind community about abuse. And I think that counseling would help people, because it would help them to be more confident. It would help them to know, like, what is abuse, how to handle, like, if they're going through a difficult situation with a boyfriend, the counselor could help them with that. And I also wanted to make sure that you plugged the Blind Therapist Collective, which you and Jenneth Lucas were instrumental in founding.
Absolutely. So, so we are doing, for anybody who is a part of the blindness community that has experienced, is a survivor of harassment, verbal, physical, psychological abuse. We are doing an initiative to help connect people with resources, provide them some short-term peer support services. So there's a collective of mental health professionals and other survivors as peer supports. We're all working really hard to try to help, get a group together to provide some mutual support, peer support. We're not doing therapy, but we are using therapeutic concepts and helping people to connect to local and national resources, as well as some long-term therapy if that's what they're interested in. So the email that you can send is, again, we'll just link it. It's going to be easy if we just link it at the bottom so that everybody has access to that, and you can send
just in case.
Sure, absolutely. So just in case, it's so it's Blind SS, and that's Survivor Support Collective @gmail.com.
So Blind SS Collective.
At gmail.com.
So BLINDSS COLLECTIV @gmail.com.
Yes.
And I will link below.
Yeah, and we'll link, absolutely, yes.
Well,
and then my email, just you were saying, sorry, I was going to say,
go for it.
My email is, so it's Maida, which is M as in Mary, AID as in dog, A, and then my last name, which is AV as in Victor, D as in dog, IC U as in umbrella, N as in Nancy, Omaha, which is OMAHA.edu. Again, we'll link that because I know that's really long.
And I love that you say V as in Victor, because I always have to do that too. Or like people put out like Stacy Serdenka or Stacy Serbanka or something. Someone's like, yes, V as in Victor, E, N as in Nancy. Would you like to share your phone number or credit card? That's at this time.
Yes, I'll just be your ATM. No, I'm kidding. Absolutely.
You'll get lots of drunk dial. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Maida.
Thank you. Have a great night, everybody.